Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinikka Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Welcome to the Even Better podcast. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining in today. I am delighted with another chance to visit with Jamee Eggers. Jamee has been a friend and colleague of mine for a couple of years now, and I've just enjoyed getting to know her and her variety of background and her interests and the things that she brings to the table. So she's the producer education director at the Iowa Pork Producers Association, and does a whole lot of things with that I will not say as eloquently as she will, but I know that she brings together folks in the ag space in a way that just really helps our agricultural community thrive, and it has just been doing really great things for our community. And she's keenly right now, as we're recording this, we're in the midst of COVID-19, and I know that Jamee is bridging the gap between people whose lives have kind of gone on much the same way as they were before and those whose lives are completely differently. And so she's kind of straddling that right now. And Jamee, I am so delighted to have you on this call. Thank you so much for being here.
The pleasure is truly mine. It's great to talk to you again like this, Sinikka.
Awesome. Well, so among the things that I know about you that our listeners don't know yet is that I have no recollection of being involved in a conversation with you where you weren't fully prepared. Like, you walk into a moment, and as you arrive in that conversation, it's like you're walking on water. It's like you've already anticipated all of the things that could possibly happen and all of the things that it's just really, really delightful. Every conversation that we've had, whether it's just a one-on-one conversation or a group meeting or a coffee at a coffee shop, I have delighted in your ability to be prepared. And so that was kind of what you've got some secret sauce there, lady. And I would love to hear and have you share with our listeners your secret sauce. And we've called it 4 things about being prepared. Is that a fair enough intro?
I think that's pretty fair. You may have oversold my ability to plan ahead a little bit, but that's probably pretty fair.
So give us some background. How did you get good at this whole planning thing?
I think by nature, I'm kind of a planner. So I have 2 degrees in animal science. So science, research, all of those things kind of lend itself to being of the planning or preparing ahead persuasion. I also have a mother that is probably a little too far on the planning and a little less on the flexibility of her planning. But I think I just kind of, by nature, I just am a bit of a planner. I like to know what's going to happen or what could happen. And I do have some level of sweaty palms if I can't really think through that ahead of time.
Fair enough. So you've got these 4 tips that I want to share with our listeners, and I'd love to have you share with our listeners 4 tips, 4 things about being prepared. Your first thing there just surprised me when you shared this in advance, that this was your first point, and I just love it. First point is on returning value. Your point being prepared helps you return value. What do you mean by that? That is so awesome.
Well, returning value is one of my core values. It's something that's written on the whiteboard behind me here in my office, and just something that I try to live out every day. But primarily in my workspace, many of the producers or the stakeholders with whom I work every day are volunteering their time. So they're giving up time voluntarily to help this organization that I work for. And they do that to make the pork industry better as a whole in Iowa. But at the same time, they are legitimately taking time away, sometimes physically, not right now, of course, in the age of social distancing, but they're literally taking time away from their businesses, from their pigs, from their communities, and from their families. And I have a pretty sincere responsibility to making the most of that volunteer time and ensure that, when they do leave their families or their communities or their jobs or their pigs, that they're seeing value being returned in that time that they've given up somewhere else.
Absolutely. So thinking about preparation as a way to make sure that when you're in that moment, it is the most valuable moment it can be for everyone who's involved. That's a really delightfully other-focused perspective. Thank you, Jamee. Okay, so let's talk about your second one, risk mitigation. Now, this is definitely, when I talk about risk mitigation from my standpoint, what we're talking about is anticipating those uncertainties, those things we don't know, but that could happen. As a project manager, I deal with risk mitigation all the time. What are risk response planning? What could go wrong? And if something happens, then what are the outcomes? And so what are my responses to it? And so that's just something I live and breathe. But in your industry, I imagine it's different. But how does that risk mitigation, as your second tip for being prepared, how does that play out?
Well, as I was writing this to you, I was thinking about, I started to type being prepared, AIDS, and risk mitigation. And then I crossed that out and I said, no, wait, risk mitigation is being prepared. And then I crossed that out and I was like, no, it's actually both, right? So being prepared helps you with risk mitigation. And then sometimes risk mitigation is the act of preparing or being prepared, right? And I love how you shared your definition and how that fits into project management space, the definition of risk mitigation. Here at Iowa Pork, we define it as identifying, evaluating, and then prioritizing any of the risks. And those risks could be to the organization as itself, to our producers, to processors, food producers, or even sometimes we talk about risks that the pigs have. So we talk about them we look at all of those and not all of them at the same time. And I think we can all agree that risk mitigation, whether it's for the pigs or whether it's for food processors, is just good business, right? And I also hear kind of personally my job, I'm in the business of problem solving. And I think it's next to impossible to do problem solving if you don't think about what could happen, if you don't name threats, if you don't talk about what could happen, good or bad.
You bet. And I'm thinking right now, just on Monday of this week in our Daily Connections call, which is a call that we've been having in response to the COVID-19 situation, we were talking about contingency planning, and we were talking about thinking ahead, if something happens, then what is the impact? And so what is our response? And using the same strategies that we do for risk management in project management, but really thinking in advance, okay, what could go wrong? What are the things? And to your point and your description about within your industry could come from anywhere, right? And it could impact any one of us. What is it that could go wrong? Well, okay, then we could lose power or something, in an event situation, we could have fewer attendees than we were expecting or more attendees than we were expecting. In a family situation, a family member could get sick. In a given technology situation, the technology could let us down. And if it lets us down, then what's the impact? And so how do we prepare for the back end? So let's take that though, and let's stop and think about let's get down into your ability to do that contingency planning or that risk mitigation. Like even in a meeting, when you're thinking ahead about whether they're group meetings that you're facilitating or one-on-ones, what kinds of things would you share? What kinds of things do you think in your head as you're preparing? What could go wrong, or how does that process go for you?
A lot of times the committee work that I do, so getting a wide variety of stakeholders together to churn through an issue, or, right now, for example, the research committee is scoring and ranking proposals, scientific research proposals. And that now we've kind of had to adopt that process to being for virtually, and they're doing that electronically in their own homes instead of sitting in the room talking to each other. So in preparing for the research committee, as a good example, to move from a face-to-face meeting where they're used to really churning out comments and feedback on proposals to each other to an electronic version, I had to think through a lot of things like, what if the technology doesn't work? Or what if somebody has a problem with the Google form that they're submitting all of that on? What happens if none of the reviewers get their comments back on the deadline? So then it shortens the time frame that I have to aggregate all those scores and turn that around to the committee. What happens if when I first started thinking about this new process, I thought, well, what happens if we don't get any proposals? Then what do I do?
Anyway.
So that's a good example of a committee work that's happening right now. And in terms of some kind of task force and strategy things, the answer is similar to your question about meetings. Is I've often had to think ahead or prepare for kind of the relationships that do exist or don't exist in the people that are in the room. So if it's a group that's meeting for the first time and they don't really know each other, then I have to be very thoughtful about what kind of icebreaker question to ask them. Or sometimes if I have, and we'll kind of get to this a little bit later, but if you have a really difficult if a personality that you know is really difficult for your meeting, planning ahead and thinking about who else in the room could help you by saying some things, or, how do you manage for if they launch a hand grenade into your meeting, how are you going to respond to that type of stuff?
You bet. So in meeting situations and in one-on-ones, that idea of just thinking through, what if we don't find each other at the right place at the right time? Okay, so let's plan for that. What if we're not clear, we're using technology and we're not clear which of us is supposed to talk first? Okay, let's plan for that. And, what if, as we've already talked about, what if the technology lets us down, or, what if one of us gets interrupted along the way? I think really just asking ourselves those what if questions is just a great way to show up prepared, right? It's being prepared for that situation and for that moment. So your third tip, first one was return value, right? Make sure being prepared helps you return value. Your second one is risk mitigation, because of the relationship there between risk mitigation and being prepared. And your third point was about clarity of expectations and communications. So let's talk through that one a little bit.
I really think that planning ahead and being prepared gives you opportunities to increase your clarity in both of those. So both in expectations and in communications. And I think of all of the tips of being prepared, that's the thing I've been feeling the most in the COVID-19 era, in dealing with the pandemic. Right now, absolutely nobody loves a rambling dissertation that doesn't make any sense, right? And it just, we probably have zero tolerance for that outside of a pandemic that is making kids be at home and people work from home. And we probably have zero or limited tolerance for that right now. But we have absolutely none for it right now, right? And there's so much, it's so hard to be relentless in your environment and what you're consuming in news and communications, that I think we all have a responsibility to be specific and concise now in communications. So I think if you take the time to flesh out your plan for how you're going to communicate, or if you take the time to flesh out what your meeting agenda looks like, greater than 20 minutes before your meeting, or, taking the time to, if you're preparing resources for people that they need right now, especially right now, speed kind of kills. So if you just take a breath and look at that and run it through a filter of clarity, I think that helps a lot of people right now.
You bet. Also on yesterday's call, on the Daily Connections call, we were talking a little bit about uncertainty and about the gray there, and how some people are just really comfy with the gray. And I think of the people that I know who are, as a participant to a meeting, they're looking at the agenda as they're en route to the meeting, right? They're looking at it for the first time on their way, or as they're sitting down in their seat or in the new location. And hopefully they're not looking at it on their phone while they're driving, but I know of people that do that too, right? So we've got folks who are really comfortable with that uncertainty. I'll just slide right in. And to your point earlier about the risk mitigation, about really thinking about what could go wrong, that extra planning allows us for clarity in communications that almost, I think it almost helps or saves the tail for those people who haven't prepared, like a participant that's just showing up and they haven't had time, or for whatever reason, they have not prepared in advance. And if we've taken the initiative to make sure that agenda is crystal clear and the objective is clear, and that we're ready to open with that concise message and a little bit of a breathing space, I think that really helps the people that are flying by the seat of their pants right now.
Absolutely. And I've thought about it from there's two things that I ask myself, particularly in communications, and I try to ask myself this every day, but it feels even more important right now, is if I'm trying to communicate with somebody, especially like ahead of time of some event or something, is I ask myself, number one, what do I want to say? What do I want them to know? And then number two is, how do I want them to feel? And it seems like that how do I want them to feel has been the somewhat more important part right now in communications.
Yeah. It is really important right now. And I think we're talking about the reality of COVID-19. And yet I love the power in what you're saying that would be true without a pandemic, right? What do I want them to know? How many of us, if we're going to plan a communication, for those who do take the time to plan, right, at least we'll say, well, what is the outcome, right? What's the objective? What do I want them to know? But that second piece, how do I want them to feel without ever having articulated those words before? I think that may be how I write my emails, right? So first pass is what's the data, and then go back and add the good morning at the top of it, right?
Right. For me, the preparation part there is, so I make sure that I have, like you were saying, the data is correct on first pass, right? I have captured what I want them to know. But the other piece of it in preparation, how do I want them to feel, is an inventory of, if this is a one-on-one conversation, what's my facial expression, or what's my posture, what's my tone, all of those things, because that very much affects how people feel from what you have communicated to them. So I think it's important to think about that and take some inventory of those other pieces as preparation.
You bet. Man, that is so wonderful. I'm just going to say it out loud again because it's so wonderfully powerful. The things you ask yourself as you're preparing is, what do you want them to know, and how do you want them to feel? I want to say that one more time so that everybody hears that. That is so powerful as far as preparing for clarity in expectations and communications. Not just what do you want them to know, but also how do you want them to feel? What a great way to be prepared. So as these tips, 4 things about being prepared, empowering others was a 4th tip. That one was another one that kind of surprised me. Let's explore that one. That's novel. It's exciting. So let's take it apart. What does that mean?
Oh, kind of similar to the first one about returning value. If you're preparing ahead of time, it provides a lot of opportunities or a lot of windows for a person to empower others in that situation. So I can kind of think of 4 main examples. We don't necessarily have to go through all of them, but I look at my team around me, and I have some quieter or more timid team members, or maybe even a committee member or a producer who's doing this for the first time, and they're kind of scared to speak up or share their thoughts publicly. So what I like to do is prepare ahead of time and ask them, like, what are your thoughts? What would you like shared in our upcoming meeting? And then, kind of asking them, would you like me to share that for you? Or would you like me to create a space for you to share it? And that gives them an opportunity to be a little bit less fearful. And then if it is me creating an opportunity for them to share that on their own, hopefully it's empowering or making them feel safe to do so in that environment. And like I mentioned before, that also helps with your kind of the ones on your team or the ones on the committee or whatever that won't shut up. It helps you manage that a little bit ahead of time as well, right?
Right. I
think a lot about the people who are of a different personality type than me, so you've got people that you work with that really, really, really need to know. They're like we were talking about yesterday, that do not thrive in the uncertainty, right? They cannot do it. And so if you have a meeting coming up, or you have some sort of event or something that is requiring an outcome from somebody, they may take a much longer time frame to produce that answer or produce that good idea or produce their contribution to that thing. And so I think if you give them a longer time frame to think about what's expected of them or what they need to produce, that those people feel more comfortable and empowered to actually do that. Nobody has to wait for inspiration, is what I like to say. You can plan ahead and let it be a little easier.
Well, and that ties in, before you go on to your couple other examples, that ties in beautifully to your point about what do you need them to know and how do you need them to feel. Because if you stop and think about how awkward and uncomfortable it is for those folks who don't like to be put on the spot, and you've just put me on the spot, you've asked me to tell you something, and if you give me 2 hours or you give me an hour and a half or 30 minutes of quiet thinking time, I will come back to you with a wonderful answer. But if you put me on the spot, I'll sound like a rambling idiot, or I'll be just really uncomfortable and perhaps not use any words at all. So if you can put that other person in mind and really make it about them first, that gives you that chance to think ahead and get their input ahead, which, this is all still part of planning, because now we got to back up, right? Because I have to have planned that I'm going to need someone so that I can give them enough time to respond and then still incorporate their response. This is not a thing you do on the fly.
No, absolutely not. And then I think the last example that I have is really the I, the me. I can be the loud one in a meeting sometimes, and I need to give my team opportunities to share their thoughts. And so if I know ahead of time that they have something that they really want to share and that they're really passionate about, or they're really, they're really comfortable about saying, then I know that that's my cue to shut up. And I won't know that if I don't ask them ahead of time, or I don't prepare a little bit ahead of time for that to be a thing.
Well, that's lovely. Thinking about their opportunity to shine. So in all of these examples, as you're pointing to your fourth point there, which is empowering others, this is really a servant leadership mindset. This is really, it's not about me. It's about letting someone else have their space, letting someone else have what they need, letting someone else grow, letting someone else shine. Whether it's that person who needs a little bit of encouragement to speak up, or maybe a little bit of help to say less, or maybe a little bit of advanced preparation to be willing or able to share their thoughts, or maybe just a bit of silence from me so that they can share their thoughts. It's very, very timely, because one of the things that I've been working on these last few days is some of the advanced prep that we do for our Lead the Way series. We've got a virtual coaching series, and the 6th session in Lead the Way is really about delegation and growing bench strength. And it really brings back that servant leadership mindset of, it's not about me, it is about developing others. And I have long believed that it is my joy as a leader. If I am your leader, if you've given me leadership permission, then it's my joy to help you become the best version of yourself. But I think in your preparation, you are taking this even further than that, which is so beautiful, Jamee. You're saying, they may not be people I lead. They may be people who volunteer with me. They may be my colleagues. They may be my leader. This is my joy, is to help you be your best self, regardless of whether I lead you or not.
Absolutely. Yes. I could not have said that any better myself.
Really, really lovely. So maybe this is unfair to put you on the spot with this, but you said, you gave some example of when you had sweaty palms, not being quite prepared for a conversation. Do you have any stories that you can share about when you didn't get a chance to apply some of these tips and you didn't prepare, or the flip side, when you prepared so well that you're like, they think I walk on water, and I actually might today?
Oh, I'd have to think about that. So I have a task force that you actually helped me in the preparation with a little over a year ago, and the first 2 meetings of that group gave me sweaty palms, even kind of despite planning. I think just because there was so much at stake, and there were so many opinions to aggregate, and so many thoughts to aggregate, that I felt like I didn't even know where to start. But I will tell you that they're kind of, having some pre-meetings and getting some ideas ahead of time as preparation, and especially kind of what could go wrong, the risk mitigation steps were the key parts of preparation there. I had a webinar this morning that I was not at all prepared for, and I was reading the agenda in my car on the way to work, which I shouldn't have been doing.
I won't tell.
I do not feel like I was a value add to that meeting because of that, but that's my own doing.
Well, and I think about in those 2 examples, you had one that I know was a high stakes conversation, and it was really, really important, and you invested. It was a big deal, and you invested. This was not a couple of minutes in planning and preparation. This was a big deal, and so you gave it the appropriate amount of planning. I know you and I talked weeks before the first meeting, and I know you were doing meetings between meetings and preparing and anticipating things. Would you say that every one of your meetings requires weeks and weeks of planning before you have them?
No, I would not. No. I think I have my own hard and fast rule that if I'm organizing or facilitating any type of meeting, at the very least, I will get the agenda out to the group a week ahead of time, at the very least. Sometimes a little bit sooner, and sometimes I tweak it between then. And I think for that kind of average basic meeting like that, where I get the agenda out a week ahead of time, that maybe takes 1 to 2 hours of planning, and not nearly the scope of planning that those other kind of large high stakes meetings do.
Right. But the idea, that's a great rule of thumb, getting the agenda out a week before, or at least a week before. I know others that are working on, hey, if there's an agenda as we walk into the room, that's enough, or an agenda the day before or 2 days before. But giving yourself that space a week in advance to have it out and to have thought about it, and so that your subconscious may have chewed on it a little bit, and you may be even wiser as you go into the meeting than you were when you sent out the agenda. That seems like a good rule of thumb, a week ahead.
I will tell you that the planning that I did for this podcast was probably the shortest turnaround and the least amount of prep for something of this scope that I've done. Like, I was winging these notes to you on Wednesday of this week, and we recorded on Friday, which is not my style at all, but
but I think it's coming together quite well, because there are things that you know, and there are things that you believe. Oh, Jamie, this has been great. So I'm going to recap your main points here, and then I'm going to ask my closing question, which is the question I always ask. So as we talked about, these are 4 things about being prepared. The first is just knowing that being prepared helps you return value. The second is that being prepared is directly linked to risk mitigation. One does the other, and the other does the one. Being prepared helps you increase your clarity of expectations and communication. And being prepared helps you empower others. Just 4 really, really lovely points. Any closing remarks on those 4 points?
No, I don't think so. I think we got them.
Awesome. So, and then here's my question. What's making you even better these days, Jamie?
I had to think long and hard about this one ahead of time, because I did have the spoiler alert that you would ask me this. So I would tell you that today, at least this week, it has been being relentless with my environment. So being relentless about what I'm consuming in terms of news, and relentless about what I'm surrounding myself with in the environment, like distractions, and making sure that I'm moving. And regardless if I'm in my home office space or in my office space, is just being really relentless about my environment right now.
Awesome. Thank you. And especially in this disrupted time, there's not a whole lot that we have control over. So that where you can manage your space, good for you doing that. Well, Jamie, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. This has been a joy to visit with you today.
The pleasure really is mine.
Thanks, Jamie. And to our listeners, this is Sinikka Waugh. I've been visiting with Jamee Eggers. Thank you so much for being part of the Even Better podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.